It's alright if they don't get it, 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 it's alright. It's alright. It's alright. It's alright if they don't get it.
In the era of humoral medicine, the notion that anything could specifically be biological was a nonsense. Quite clearly, everything was connected to everything else. The bio, the psycho, and the social were enmeshed. Then, with Descartes, madness became entirely physical, the problem lying in the body machine. See how the pendulum swings. Locke comes along, and now we have this idea that madness could basically be reduced to delusion. In other words, the body is thinking right, but the mind is failing to make correct associations between the world and the individual. It was Locke that held the key to the door, sorry about that would result in the emergence of moral therapy. But don't take it from me. Listen to what Esquirol had to say in 1838. The insane are, as Locke remarks, like those who lay down false principles from which they reason very justly, although their consequences are erroneous. The Frenchman Etienne Esquirol, the anointed heir of Pinel, was perhaps the pioneering figure in conceptualizing moral therapy in its paradigmatic form, both in terms of thinking about causes, but also establishing its treatments. His great work, Des Maladies Mentales, was published in 1838. It took another 7 years for it to be translated into English. By that time, the reforms that John Connolly had instituted at the Hanwell Asylum were being trumpeted loudly and clearly, so its publication was timely. What it provided in 1845 was a snapshot of what a top-class physician, thoroughly embedded in alienism, indeed someone that could almost be described as the real progenitor of moral therapy, thought about his field. And if Esquirol spoke, people listened. Esquirol was working with a limited number of disease categories. The nosology, that's what we call a taxonomy of disease, of moral therapy, was short and to the point. These were his 5 conditions. Firstly, lymphomania, which was his version of melancholia. Then there was monomania, which, to quote the translation, is a condition in which delirium is limited to one or a small number of a gay, expansive passion. Then there was mania, which is classic lunacy, in which, I'm quoting here again, the delirium extends to all kinds of objects and is accompanied by excitement. Fourthly, there was dementia, in which insensate utter folly, because the organs of thought have lost their energy and the strength requisite to fulfill their functions. Fifthly and finally, imbecility, or idiocy, in which the conformation of the organs has never been such, and that those who are thus afflicted could reason justly. Of these, only the last one was really 100% biological, because it referred to problems that were often conceived as being congenital. So what were the causes of what Esquirol and many others called mental alienation? Well, it turned out that there were a lot of them, and most were related to the social environmental. And we can see them as we flick through these pages. Causes of mental alienation are as numerous as its forms are varied. General, special, physical, moral, primitive, secondary, predisposing, exciting. That was his assessment of the situation, and you wouldn't have found many alienists to disagree with him. We can see this extraordinarily wide range in the very next paragraph, where he says, not only do climate, seasons, age, sex, temperament, profession, and mode of life have an influence upon the frequency, character, duration, crises, and treatment of insanity, but this malady is still modified by laws, civilizations, morals, and the political condition of people. It is also produced by causes whose influence is more immediate and easily appreciated. And so it went on and on. To be sure, the relationship between madness and heredity was commonly assumed, but it was one small factor among many others. It seemed, in essence, that just about any stress or event that went beyond the norm could trigger one of at least 4 of Esquirol's diseases. So here, Let's just note that moral therapy was underwritten by a predominantly psychosocial model of causation. Let us also take heed that the pendulum was about to swing back to the bio. But before we look at the recrudescence of biology, let's take a little derive, as the psychogeographers say, and explore the wonderful world of the neuroses, which for Victorians was like a meeting place for the bio, the psycho, and the social.
Look around. Here it comes. Here it comes.
So moral therapy had gone against the dominant biological tradition, but it had always been there. There had always been the belief that neurotic illnesses were, to use an anachronism, biopsychosocial in their origins. But certain illnesses might be triggered by some defect in the functioning of the nerves. In the various models doing the rounds at the time, this could be due to one of many physiological factors. The nerves might be loose or taut, or they might be too excitable or not excitable enough, or the reserves of nervous energy, which could be configured as a fluid or force, might be found depleted. It might even be possible that your biological inheritance predisposed you to certain types of nervous affliction. But whichever line you took, this was a distinctly biological or pathological way of looking at the neuroses. But it was only part of the complex interplay between predisposing and exciting causes. In particular, exciting causes, the immediate trigger for a disease, was often thought to be due to the stresses and strains of life, of the choices that people made in terms of their diet and exercise. This tradition can clearly be seen in the work of George Cheyne, a gargantuan self-styled physician who wrote the celebrated work The English Malady. Cheyne, like Burton before him, was motivated by his personal experiences. He had singularly failed to establish himself as a successful physician and had become exceedingly corpulent in the process, in modern day terms about 200 kilos. He blamed this on the way he went about trying to drum up business by visiting taverns and clubs in the search for potential clients. A convivial, if costly lifestyle that failed to achieve its ends and resulted instead in Cheyne falling into a deep melancholia. He turned his hands to reforming himself and then reforming others. He took to writing philosophical books upon health, aimed at the wealthy and fashionable, those people that were, at the time, most likely to suffer from what we would now call lifestyle diseases. Astutely he moved to Bath, the fashionable watering place that served the dyspeptic and spectacularly unhealthy English upper classes. They ate too much and they drank too much. In fact, often they did everything too much. In the diseased wealthy classes, he found an audience and a client base reflected in his The English Malady, or to give it its full title, The English Malady, or a treatise of nervous diseases of all kinds, as spleen, vapours, lowness of spirits, hypochondriacal and hysterical distempers, etc. What a mouthful. Cheyne was clearly working in the Cartesian world, as his frequent references to the human machine testify. Indeed, his categorization of the body could have come straight out of Descartes 101, a machine of an infinite number and variety of different channels and pipes, filled with various and different liquors and fluids, perpetually running, gliding, or creeping forward, or returning backward in a constant circle, and sending out little branches and outlets to moisten, nourish, and repair the expenses of living. That the intelligent principle or soul resides somewhere in the brain, where all the nerves or instruments of sensation terminate, like a musician in a finely framed and well-run organ case. That these nerves are like keys, which being struck on or touched, convey the sound and harmony to the sentient principle or musician. That wasn't the last of his metaphors about the body machine. In fact, he larded them on thick, just so his readers got the point. You can go and see for yourself. Ultimately, though, the majority of his causes of nervous disease boiled down to having their origins in the ill state of the humours, affecting the functioning of the nerves, or a problem with the nerves themselves, which experience a weakness and laxity of tone or elasticity, or their vibrations, tremors, or other actions might be stopped, blocked, hindered or impeded. And while these problems might originate in the hereditary constitution of the patient, they were often as not a direct result of the individual's way of life or the environment in which he or she lived. And this was how the book got its name. Chain argued that the English life, particularly the way that the prosperous were living, was the principal cause of these diseases. For example, take this chapter head, which basically sums up his position, that what is swallowed down and received into the habit is the first and chief efficient cause of all that mankind suffer in their bodies, or put another way, gormandizing and boozing was stuffing up the nerves. I could go on, but have not got the time, but will leave Chain with this one last quote. Since our wealth has increased and our navigation has been extended, we have ransacked all the parts of the globe to bring together its whole stock of materials for riot, luxury, and to provoke excess. The imperial success of the nation was resulting in the nervous breakdown of its leaders. By the time Charles Darwin had got off the Beagle in 1836, a lot more was known about the nerves. In Chain's time, they were conceived in terms of fluid dynamics. They were tubes around which nervous energy circulated in liquid form, plumbing for the soul, so to speak. By the 1830s, heaps of new things had been discovered. For example, nerves could be afferent or efferent. In other words, different nerve filaments conveyed motor or sensory impulses. Also, the reflex arc. In other words, some impulses never got back to the brain. Neuroscience is groping towards an understanding of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, the parts of the nervous system that deal with fight or fright responses. Most important of all, electricity had come into the picture. The experiments of Volta and Galvani, to name two, had indicated that nerves worked through conveying electrical impulses. All this science fed into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But if you think that that meant that the causes of neuroses had become any less biopsychosocial than in Chain's age, you'd have to think again. So, when Darwin walked off the Beagle, got his land legs back, he was working in a world where the understanding of the functioning of the nerves was almost modern. But the relationship between the nerves and disease was anything but. Darwin spent much of his life sick. He was prone to nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and spells of extreme fatigue. In the late 1840s and early 1850s, it was a serious break to his research, and he frequently had to resort to the ministrations of the cold water cure. Historians have been intrigued by what it was that caused Darwin's illness, and speculation has run fast and furious. Some have argued he contracted Chagas disease during his stay in South America. Some believe it was due to a defect in his mitochondrial DNA. But mirroring the body's psychodynamic dramatic causes, of which stress has predominated, this stress has been configured in a number of different ways. A Freudian emphasis upon his relationship with his father, the belief that he was torn apart by the religious implications of his theory, even that he was worried that evolution was an idea that would damage the whole fabric of society. That any of this is true. But what we can do is look at how Darwin and his doctors configured his illness, and they all believed that stress was a moving force. Not the stress of his heretical biological views, but the hard work that was taxing his nervous system and his brain. Work sent signals from the brain down to the stomach, causing indigestion and other symptoms. The treatment was to try and modify diet and work regimes, and it's significant that he seemed to flourish best when removed to a centre of the water cure, where all work-related distractions were removed from him, and constant bathing, plain food and water with exercise really seemed to work wonders on his dilapidated constitution. This was a very typical way of conceiving the relationship between the nerves and disease at this time. Indeed, as indicated by my musings at the beginning of this lecture, it is what made mid-Victorian thinking about the body and mind in sickness and in health remain fundamentally holistic in orientation. For if Darwin had had a poor diet, the doctors would then have considered that his stress and fatigue was caused by irritation in the stomach passing through the nervous system to the brain. Here, depression could cause dyspepsia and dyspepsia depression, with the nervous system the conduit for the disease itself. At its most extreme, women were on the sharp end of this way of thinking. Obviously, the figure of the hysteric looms large, but there were other female maladies like chlorosis, the anorexias, and other nervous conditions that were felt to be exclusively female. Nevertheless, they were still configured within the bio, the psycho, and the social dimension, and were gendered in each of the spheres. Darwin's nervous condition was a manly one, and was related to the work that he undertook. Women's nervous conditions were usually subordinated to their sexuality and their reproductive organs. Overall, however, there was another metaphor that shaped mid-Victorian understandings of neuroses that derived from the operations of capitalism. As Oppenheim describes it, there was a finite supply of nerve force that any individual possessed at a given time. Only so much of the force could be spent. Overdraw on the force, a nervous collapse would result. And of course, rather like money, there were many ways that you could get overdrawn, from hard work to hard living. So, during the golden years of Victoria's reign, the middle period of the 19th century, when Britain absent-mindedly managed to captivate half the world, the vast majority of mental illnesses, whether psychotic or neurotic, were configured within an holistic framework bound together within the biological, the psychological, and the social spheres. But the pendulum was about to swing resolutely back to the biological. Heredity, now integrated into an evolutionary model, would allow the reconceptualization of many mental maladies within this new way of knowing. But it wasn't just evolution that got in on the act. Other ideas would be mooted about the causes of madness, including the notion that it might be the result of a plain old infection.